Right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Willem Kraus from Knowledge Resources. Welcome to our afternoon seminar around corporate politics and toxic environments, work environments in the new world of work, or the very new world of work, mostly with regard to remote working places. So let me quickly tell you what we're going to cover this afternoon. Firstly, you can utilize the Q&A box to pose your questions, or if you want to use the chat room, please feel free to use it. At the same time, we're going to have the two presentations from Niven and Renata, and then after that, we will have the questions and answers and a general discussion, obviously. I'm quite looking forward to this afternoon's session. So Niven is going to talk about remote work. Does corporate politics still play a role? And there's a specific reason why she talks about it, because she is about to publish a book around that specific field. And then Renata is going to have a discussion around understanding, managing, and transforming toxic workplace culture. Okay, Katie, can you carry on for me with the slides? I just want for the delegates' side, give them an idea of what's coming up from our side. We've got a couple of events. The first one is the mental health in the workplace, which is taking place next week, and then followed the week after that, the HR Leaders Summit, where we specifically have some of the top HR directors in the country talking about how they are navigating their organization through this tough time. And then, if ever there was a time that we need to be agile, then it's now. So we have our third conference on HR Goes Agile, and obviously having it as an online event now, and with also a number of case studies from various companies. And then the talent management one is coming up in July. There you can see organizations like APSA, Unilever, Old Mutual, etc., are going to talk about how they are now. Well, I need to mention that also Renata, JVR is also involved there. And there we're going to talk about the new world of work and the implications for talent management, new skills that we require, and also new ways of workforce planning, etc., etc. And then we have two international people on afternoon, morning seminars for us. The first one is Miriam Neelan, who is the head of or coordinating instruction design at Accenture worldwide, and she published this book just a couple of weeks ago on evidence-informed learning design, and she's going to have an afternoon session in also end of June. No, it's a morning session, 10 o'clock to 12, and then that's in June. And second lastly, we have Dr. Penny Pullen, who has written this book, Virtual Leadership. She published it about a year ago. And now, obviously, everybody is into this specific book of hers. She's from the UK. She will run an afternoon seminar around virtual leadership for us on the 7th of July. And then, as I'm going to introduce Niven, Niven's latest book, or no, the first book, I must say, Niven, will be released hopefully end of next week, early the week following, and it's about if you don't do politics, politics will do you. Beautiful title. Will be published by ourselves, so we'll let you know about it as soon as when it's out. So Niven works as a leadership and strategy consultant, and she facilitates various clients in South Africa, Australia, UK, and even Germany. And then in industries as diverse as financial services, professional services, oil and gas, media, retail, and so on. She's also a visiting lecturer at Henley Business School. And as I said, she runs this program on navigating office politics. So we're looking forward to your presentation, Niven, on a very, very topical issue. And then Renata Schirrer, she is the managing director at JVR Consulting Psychologists, which is a premier psychological consulting firm in South Africa. She She focuses mainly, or she's got a specific interest in the field of leadership development and engagement, and focusing on optimizing human potential in organizations. And then she is well known for her work that she's done in the field of leadership development, psychopathy in the workplace, toxic leadership, and conflict mediation. So to both of you, Niven and Renata, welcome this afternoon. We're really looking forward to your presentations. And over to you, Niven.
Thank you, Willem. Just share the screen. Right, so good afternoon, everyone. I am going to first off start the timer because I have 20 minutes for this, and it's always for me a sign of respect if I can keep to the time that I've been allocated and that I've allocated to other people. And in the 20 minutes, what I'd like to do is two things. The first is to just really get clear on what office politics are. Otherwise, we stand a very good risk of talking at cross purposes for the rest of the seminar. So let me just define what I'm talking about when we talk about office politics. And then secondly, having defined it, and you may well have questions, and I mean, that's fine, we'll talk about it in the Q&A. But having defined it as I define it, then what are the implications, if any, for working remotely? And so let me start by just taking a step back and explaining how I got into this. It was about 3 years ago. I've had quite a lekker career, actually. I've worked at senior roles, in executive roles at the Reserve Bank, at Standard Bank, at NGOs, in South Africa, like Wilhelm says, overseas. And a good friend of mine runs a very successful leadership development program and was needing somebody to do something on office politics, so a day's module. And she mentioned it to me and thought I might be interested. Well, I mean, I rolled my eyes, made some gagging sounds, you know, the typical kind of reactions to the mere mention of office politics. And I was like, no, please, do me a favor. I am not interested in that stuff in the slightest. It's unpleasant, it's unethical, it's just something I don't want to be involved in. And if I can avoid it, I will avoid it. And it's been interesting in the 3 years that I've been lecturing on the subject, because it's another whole long story how I agreed to it. But in preparing to lecture for it, I had to really think about and understand a subject I didn't understand. I had to think about and reflect on my career. And the things that I've just said now about my initial reaction to office politics are pretty much word for word the kinds of things that I hear when I lecture on the subject and we kick things off. And it really doesn't matter if it's male groups, female groups, mixed groups, if they're in South Africa or overseas. There's this very widespread idea around office politics being awful. And I think we all have kind of a single story about politics. And I'm going to show you a short video here. It's only about a minute or so long. If it sticks, I'll skip it. But for any of you who have watched the Netflix series House of Cards with Kevin Spacey, he is trying to become president of the United States. He does become president, all kinds of very underhanded, unpleasant means. And the way he talks about politics in this video is, I think, very much the way I saw it and the way most people see it when we start our workshops and our lectures. And the story goes something like this. So have a look.
And the butchery begins. Any pugilist worth his salt knows when someone's on the ropes, that's when you throw a combination to the gut and a left hook to the jaw. In Gaffney, we had our own brand of diplomacy. Shake with your right hand, but hold a rock in your left. The road to power is paved with hypocrisy and casualties. Never regret. There are two types of vice presidents, doormats and matadors. Which do you think I intend to be? The only thing more satisfying than convincing someone to do what I want is failing to persuade them on purpose. From the lion's den to a pack of wolves, when you're fresh meat, kill and throw them something fresher. Every kitten grows up to be a cat. They seem so harmless at first, small, quiet, lapping up their saucer of milk. But once their claws get long enough, they draw blood, sometimes from the hand that feeds them. For those of us climbing to the top of the food chain, there can be no mercy. There is but one rule: hunt or be hunted.
Yeah, well, no, fine. So there you go. So of course that's a dramatization, but again, in my experience, that's pretty much how people see politics. Really, really unpleasant, run like hell. And actually, the thing that we all need to understand, the thing that I needed to understand about politics, was that that definition, that version of office politics that plays out there, that we may have all seen play out in our career, the really unpleasant, underhanded, Machiavellian type of politics, is of course a version of politics, and we would be naive to say it doesn't exist. We've all seen it. But that is not the whole story of what politics are. Actually, what politics are is very much what I've got on the screen. It's about the informal, unofficial, behind the scenes things that we are all engaging in all the time. To sell ideas, get our things approved, increase power, any kinds of objectives that we've got on our plate. And so this idea of bad politics and the kind of ruthless politics we saw there being the only version of politics is completely and entirely wrong. There's a whole other version and a whole other side to politics that I, for one, was completely oblivious to, and that I now spend my time in lectures and in the book opening other people's eyes to. And it's really critical that we understand that they are completely neutral. They're not necessarily negative, they're not necessarily positive, they're just the informal, unofficial. How we show up, how people use them to their advantage, to other people's advantage, that's of course all part of the mixed and interesting part of human behavior. But they are not by definition in and of themselves only negative. And this is something people grapple with, but I really want to land the point that first of all, they are not, like I said, necessarily negative. And second of all, you will not escape them. They happen everywhere. I've worked in NGOs, they happen there, even with people trying to, and I say this sincerely, I don't say it facetiously, even with people trying to save the world, there was the politics of the informal, unofficial, behind the scenes stuff. In our organization and in the sector as a whole. I have a friend who was a church minister for 10 years and eventually got tired of leading a congregation and thought it's time to have a change, and was quite nervous about going to a corporate because she'd heard so much about office politics in corporates. And after a few months said, oh, do me a favor, office politics are a complete breeze compared to church politics. And so the list goes on and the examples are many. But the reality is we are not going to escape them. So how we play them and how we use them becomes critical. And Kathleen Kelly-Reardon is an interesting woman who's an organizational psychologist. She works in the States, studied the behavior in organizations her whole career. And I love the title of this book because it is what it all boils down to, that it's all politics. Winning in a world where talent and hard work are not enough. Would that talent and hard work were enough, but they're not. And there are multiple studies that I can point you in the direction of that show that it's not your technical qualifications, it's not your technical skill, it's not even your sparkling personality that determines your career success. It is about your political skill, which basically boils down to relationships, networks, perceptions, and power. And so as much as having those skills can really benefit your career, there are just as many studies that show that not having those skills can seriously derail your career. And so with that hopefully landed after 9 minutes, that that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about politics. The art of influencing people at work to get things done. If that's what we're talking about, well, how many of the things that we thought we know, how many of the things that I have seen and that I do know about office politics now play out in this incredibly unprecedented time where we are all grappling, and as we were saying on the call before you all joined us, all having to pivot and reinvent ourselves and try to figure out, what does this mean? And one of the most interesting things that I read at the start of all of this asked the question, which I'm still asking, and I think anybody who thinks they have an answer is probably premature. But the question was, is this whole move to remote working, different way of socializing, different way of thinking, is it a storm? Is it a winter? Or is it an ice age? And I mean, at this stage, we don't know. Does this herald a complete reversal of how we've always worked? Or is it just a blip on the radar, and in a few weeks and months, we go back to what is familiar and what we crave, for better or for worse? Like I said, none of us know. But in this situation that we're in, where most of us are remote working, I mean, I can see everyone's backgrounds behind me on every call. You can see my background in my dining room. What stays the same around what I've said around office politics, and what changes? And in thinking about this, there's a couple of things that have struck me. And the first is, obviously, there's a lot of people who, when they took the chance to work remotely before COVID even happened, couldn't stop telling anyone who would listen really how fabulous it was. No commute, I can walk between the office and my kitchen in my pajamas, and for heaven's sake, hallelujah, what a blessing. I do not have to deal with office politics. I just have to focus on my job. What a pleasure. But I think one of the things that people who work remotely either don't initially realize and or soon come to realize is that there can be a whole bunch of assumptions and perceptions slash misperceptions about people who work remotely. Again, I'm not talking about now when we're all pretty much in the same boat, but at a time and in a place where some people are working remotely and the bulk of the workforce is in an office, there can be a lot of assumptions around how committed people are to their job, to their career, to the company. And I mean, I've heard snide remarks made before, yeah, they're working. And so this perception is something that people really have to think about it and manage if they're working remotely, especially because, as I've said, at the heart of politics is perception, influence, relationships, and power. The second thing is, in work, there are basically two components that we're all having to manage all the time. The one is the task, the task at hand, what it is we need to get done. And the second one is about the relationships that enable what we're there to do or disable, make it easier or make it flipping difficult. And this quote is a lovely one that I bring into my lectures because it really resonated for me when I read it, in terms of how I've sometimes seen myself show up, and I've certainly seen people who report into me show up. And this idea that we make the mistake of confusing work with school. And so essentially, like I'm saying, focusing purely on the task at hand and saying, well, if we get the task right, somebody will notice and will give us an A. And so often people will say, listen, I'm here to do my job, and all this relationship building and getting to know people and networking is a distraction from my real job. Actually, especially the more senior you become, it is a critical part of your job. And so if this risk that we focus only on tasks at the expense of relationships is a real risk, even when we are seeing people all day, every day in a physical environment, that risk only becomes greater in a virtual environment. And as that risk becomes realized, so it has all kinds of impact on the way people can play politics or have politics played around them. And so part of what I say sometimes in lectures, it comes from this idea that invisible contributions have no value, have no political value. And so part of as I've said, the big important part of politics is about managing the perceptions that people have of you, in how they're seeing what you're doing and how they see that you're doing it. And this is a particularly interesting gender connotation as well, because there is a fair amount of research that shows generally, and of course every rule has its exceptions, but generally women get promoted on their track record and men get promoted on their potential. And so then even more so, as a female, your track record matters. Your track record being visible matters. And how much more of a risk you're running when you and your track record are out of sight and out of mind with all the people you work with. And so, yes, it's about perception and how people engage with you and who you are engaging with. But there was a very interesting study that Harvard did a few years ago, trying to understand more about workplace conflict and if it's the same in physical environments relative to online environments. And actually they found something quite interesting. In remote working environments, they found, and I think it was a study of about 1,300 people, that conflict can be more intense, more quickly, can damage relationships more lastingly, and can be harder to rectify. And I mean, I suppose we can all take a guess at why that is. You know, how much easier to fire off a snotty email when you're not going to bump into that person in the passage. We only have to look at social media and the social disinhibition effect. Type a comment to somebody on the other side of the world as opposed to having a conversation. And that social disinhibition that happens when you add a remove and a distance. And so this potential for conflict to really escalate in remote working environments is being investigated and being found to be more and more true, more and more often. And over and above that, I don't know about you guys, but I'm certainly seeing some interesting stuff coming out more and more at the moment about the sheer loneliness of working remotely. Of course, it's amplified at the moment, you know, with a lockdown. And again, we were saying before this call, driving down my street and seeing things closed, not being able to see people we love, seeing people we love, but at a distance and not being able to hug them. So this loneliness is not something we can underestimate. And as much as it's amplified now, it is a constant feature potentially and a constant risk of remote working. And so you can end up with this incredibly unpleasant, vicious cycle of your loneliness impacting your relationships impacting how you're doing your task or not, how you're doing your task or not impacting the perceptions that people have of you, and becoming more and more isolated and more out of the loop. And so in closing, like I say, as much as this is all up for debate at the moment, and we're all figuring this out, personally, professionally, at home, at work, with our family, with our friends. I mean, the reality is, the one thing I think that's not going to change is that we are, as human beings, as we all know, social creatures. Relationships sustain us, inform us, nurture us, or do a whole bunch of damage to us. But the point is, those relationships are at the heart of what matters with office politics. Those relationships are what makes the difference between knowing what's going on, not knowing, what's going on. Feeling included, feeling excluded. Being included, being excluded. And one of the things that I say often in my lectures is that some of the most important decisions of your career are going to be made when you are not in the room. So who is in the room on your behalf? And what are they saying? And people really hear that when I'm saying it. And we can all relate to that. And if that is a risk in a physical environment, how much more so is the risk in a remote environment? Because then, you know, some of the most important decisions of your career are going to be made not only when you're not in the room, but you're not even in the building. And so, in my opinion, based on what I know now, based on what I've seen, based on what I've learned and what I've taught, remote working actually, as much as people think it gives them a chance to escape from office politics, actually makes the need for office politics and the reality of office politics and the successful navigation of office politics even more important. Thanks.
Thank you, Niven. That was quite a mouthful, to be quite honest. Okay, so we'll take questions and discussion later on. Renata, over to you.
Thanks, Willem. Thank you, Niven. That was very insightful, and I think you said a lot of things already that I'm also going to say. So, or I'm probably going to link into you. I was thinking along the way, oh, am I saying things that's similar or different? But I think we're probably just actually dovetailing very nicely, because it is such a reality. Obviously, my approach with today's discussion is specifically around, where things go wrong and where office politics is actually, creating toxicity, etc. So let me just quickly also share my screen here. And just want to check that you can see. You can see the screen and you can see when it's moving in the right way, hey?
Yes, it looks right, Renata.
Okay, so fabulous. So, you get these, and I'll also try to keep to my time, because that one is always especially difficult for me to do. So please remind me. When this advert came out about the webinar, someone posted this comment: "Don't fool yourself, the dynamics of office politics and workplace culture persist with the added dynamics and demands of technology and virtual connection." So I thought that actually laid the table quite nicely for our discussion today. It was someone who commented on the actual advert. So what I want to talk about today is really those three things, the science, the costs, and the causes of a toxic culture. Then, what does it look like in a virtual environment? But also, what do we then do, or can we potentially do about it? Now, obviously, in 20 minutes, we're really just going to skim through a few things. I'm not proposing that we'll have all the answers, but hopefully we can also have some discussion afterwards. So if we look at toxic behavior, and specifically as to what Niven was also saying, typically what we know of as toxic behaviors would be those office politics that goes to backstabbing and criticizing and blaming and gossiping and all those negative behaviors where people are purposefully undermining each other. We also particularly see toxic team members are being destructive because they actually undermine the values of the leader, they degrade the team, the team culture, and often they create a lot of unnecessary drama and reaction. So as a start, there is a lot of incivility. Now, if you haven't heard of or looked at some of the information that is available about a lady called Christine Porath, she does a lot of research on incivility, and specifically she talks about it as being low intensity, defiant, whether rude, discourteous behavior with ambiguous intent to harm the target in violation of workplace norms. So that pre-imposes that there needs to be certain workplace norms in place, first of all. But secondly, also, that there is almost is this low intensity, which things typically seems like it goes under the surface. It's not that bad. You can't really put your finger on it. Is it now really rude, or did you not just understand the person? But the incivility, actually, the research that they do, talking about it being a bug that really infiltrates and spreads like cancer. and that people, and it chips away at the bottom line, etc., and that we really need to guard against it. So incivility, definitely then one thing that we see playing out in a toxic culture, but we also know that a toxic culture is much more than incivility. It's not just about working too hard, or your boss being nasty. It is really like that cancer that spreads. And it really stops also with just incivility. Actually, it goes broader than that, and it becomes a slippery slope. So if we compare ethical culture with a toxic culture, then we typically can describe an ethical culture, one that is where we see trust, we see integrity, we see accountability and respect, and we also see fairness in action, and action in accordance with an organizational code of conduct. Whereas toxicity, on the other hand, excludes some or all of that. Plus, it's the workplace, it's the breeding ground for workplace deviance. Now, I'm just quickly going to refer to workplace deviance here because I think it is particularly relevant in the sense that that is often what happens when companies end up in the news, is when there were actual workplace deviance, where there were an unethical behavior that played out, or shenanigans that happened at work. So there you have your incivility, but that is very closely linked then to bullying and harassments. And unfortunately, they also share some space with the others that starts to go towards workplace sabotage, organizational theft, withdrawal, organizational science, etc. And you can see, as these circles are all connected in this map, that one quickly goes from the one to the next to the next. So even though I'm not going to focus today on workplace deviance per se, I do think it's something that we just have to keep in mind, that what on the surface, and then especially in a virtual workplace, we may not be aware of these things or necessarily see it, but where incivility is rife and happening and it's acceptable, you are probably also going to find some of the other elements happening. So in a study by a company called M-Train, in a recently released report, Workplace Culture in 2020, they actually looked at 40,000 employees at 125 companies. I don't know how many of these were working virtually or not, but and they actually found that toxic workplaces were surprisingly common, where the highlights of the report actually said that 83% of employees wouldn't report harassment if they saw it. Now, that is quite shocking. 41% of employees don't believe that if they even talk about it, that something will happen. And that 20% of employees think managers are aware of how their power influence workplace interaction. So back to Niven's comment, is that the perception definitely is then that those managers, or from the employees, that those managers actually are playing corporate politics in a negative way, potentially. And that they are aware of how that is impacting them. And then obviously 29%, the last one there of employee survey said it's almost 30% of employees, 1 in 3, who leave the workplace because of work conflict. So I think we know these things, we read about it, we are aware of it, but it's also interesting just sometimes to just saw it in a summarized way like this. So we know that the effect of toxicity in the workplace is that creativity suffers. We know that performance deteriorates, that team spirit goes down the drain. We know that you lose customers. Basically, that's at the end of the day what happens. And it's actually something that none of us can afford these days, especially. Also, actually managing incidents like harassment, for example, or if there's fraud happening, etc., it becomes quite a costly exercise. And then that last one there, the 5th leading cause of death in the US, according to a study by Pfeiffer, was that workplace toxicity is the 5th leading cause of death. Over and above things like depression, etc., it was actually the 5th one there. So it is shocking stats that we should not forget, and should not think that it's actually not important. So the question then goes to what causes that? You know, why do we allow cultures to become toxic? Why is it so that even despite the fact that it is clear that it is in no one's best interest, does it still happen? And so if we look at the root cause of culture failures, and again back to M-Train and their model and the research that they did, is that they found that there's organizational factors and there's people factors here. But particularly the norms and the practices, meaning the rules that we have about what we do, how we do things, what is acceptable workplace behavior, those in particularly are often seen as the root cause of culture failures. All these other elements we will have. People come into the workplace with pre-existing mindsets. People come into the workplace with little or a lot of emotional intelligence. People come into the workplace with unconscious biases, and they don't even know that they are necessarily biased towards other individuals. There will always be a bit of power dynamics, and there will also, be in and out group dynamics as well. But the norms and the practices can shape and impact how those things then play out. So a question can be, can toxicity go virtual? Can it actually spread? And Niven has already talked to this. So I can just confirm, if we think about virtual versus in real life, by the way, I didn't know IRL stands for in real life, that I learned as I was preparing for, IRL, what on earth is IRL? It's for in real life. So in real life, and this is now particularly related to, this comment is particularly related to what's happening in the world at the moment. Of course, not all virtual environments are created because of COVID or a pandemic. But in this case, specifically, this researcher just spoke about the fact, or the quote was, "We're working from virtual cubicles that never underwent any planning process for transitioning from fully in-person to fully digital. And this can open up workplaces and employees to even new toxic features." So I think the dynamics and the complexity of the potential toxicity that we need to deal with or have to deal with just becomes more enhanced. So what does toxic work environments in a virtual world look like? Typical things that or the signs of a toxic workplace when it is in a virtual work environment is that people don't have the resources that they need to do the work. And of course, then they also don't have a manager who understands and respect that they don't have the resources that they need to do the work, and expect them to be available all time, anytime, because they're at home in any way. So you don't have anywhere to go. Well, I know it's only now in COVID, but because you're working from home, you should have more space and you can look at your emails tonight until 12 o'clock, etc. So there's little respect for those time boundaries. Also, often you find that, and you will see that there's actually shocking for me in any way as a psychologist, it's actually quite shocking to see how many adverts are out there for tools that you can find to electronically monitor, whether your people are working or not, and exactly, if they're clocking the hours, etc. And for me, it's just a case of, if people are at work, physically sitting in front of their computer from 8 to 5, they can do just as little work as if they wanted to, when they sit at home working from home. So obviously there's a lack of trust, in terms of whether people will be able to do their work or not. Unkind and abusive digital communication is also what Niven referred to. And I think those are one of the things where specifically researchers also found that, exactly as to what you said, Niven, that people are more easily saying things on email or a WhatsApp or a whatever than they would necessarily say to someone face to face. And also the added complexity, of course, of the person on the other side who also hears the message through their own, with their own worldviews and their own glasses on, and they don't necessarily interpret it in the way that it was intended. Let's say the person also has a reputation for being unkind, etc., then the receiver of that message will maybe have a more negative reaction in any way. The fact of people being left out and feeling isolated, never mind the fact that we are you are working, let's say, in virtually, and therefore you're not connecting with people. But you can also, in a virtual work environment, use clicks and Slack and WhatsApp groups and all those kinds of things very effectively to alienate other people and to make them aware that they're not part of a certain in-group, that they are not invited to a certain birthday celebration. Or, you know, we had a coffee session yesterday and oops, oh, sorry, we forgot to invite you. It sounds like school ground, playground behavior, but it actually really happens. So yeah, it's very unfortunate. There was a research about a company called, it's a luggage company, I forget the name now, in the US, and how they actually really used all those types of communication channels to isolate people and to catch them out on what they did, for people to vent offline about what's happening in meetings, etc., which is obviously very, very unhealthy. The micromanagement obviously happens a lot, and then the busyness over performance. That's the whole thing around, you know, I can sit in front of my desk being busy with a lot of things, multitasking. People are very easily distracted to multitask during meetings. I can just say as an example, I'm wondering how many of the participants at the moment are also checking their emails. Hopefully it's not because I'm boring them, but also just because we get distracted by what's happening on our computers, and we are tending then to multitask. And if you're in a meeting, you actually may miss important stuff. And then this one was a very interesting one to me. The loudest voices get heard. It's actually one of the norms that gives away that, you know, toxicity is rife. It means if people have to speak up and talk over others in order to be heard, and for them to know that if I'm the one talking, you know, my message, it's almost a squeaky wheel will get the oil kind of message, but in a negative way. And that people talk over each other and they don't give each other a chance to also take part. Again, links back exactly to your comments. If you're not heard, your contribution is not heard, then people will not know what you contribute. But then, unfortunately, in the virtual working environment, in virtual meetings, if there are a lot of people, you will always, you may tend to get one or two people who do all the talking or all the contribution, and the rest are quiet. So it's quite a tall order for leaders to work with getting that right. So toxicity, in my view, is virtually contagious, and it, you know, virtual is an illusory band-aid. What do I mean with that? Is people think that because we're not in the office, maybe the politics won't be there, or I don't have to face the conflict. And yes, we are perhaps shielded from in-person conflict a little bit more than we would be when we're physically at the office. But there is lots of potential for different types of conflict. And actually the conflict is potentially magnified, where because of misunderstandings and because we cannot talk with each other face to face. Also, virtual tools are often weaponized, and you know, so it's supposed to facilitate virtual working, but it's then started to be used to weaponize, you know, workplace behavior. So, for example, using Slack or WhatsApp or Microsoft Teams or whatever chat channels we are using that to sort of target people and make them feel left out and victimized. So the challenges, therefore, of virtual teams is many of the things that I've mentioned now, and core for me also, and what research also says, is the whole concept of trust. And working from a trust perspective or a trust basis is also what is almost the crux or the antidote for toxic culture. So it is interesting that with virtual teams, or not interesting, the fact is just with virtual teams, exactly that which is the thing that is so important to create a healthy culture is one of the things that is most often at risk, and that we need to manage and work very hard at to make sure that that happens. So the trust, the cohesion, the communication, all of that, very important. So creating a healthy, let's call it an e-culture, and, you know, if we treat people like they make a difference, they will. So I thought, let me just give you maybe a few tips for, let's say, professionals, for leaders, and for employees, if you'll allow me to quickly do that. So for people, professionals, first of all, if you are at the beginning of putting a team together or bringing leaders into the organization, choose wisely. Make sure that the people you bring in are the people that you need, that you want, that will bring the best. And you maybe need to also have a different, not you maybe, you have to look at what they need to do differently if they're going to manage virtual teams than in-person teams. And you need to know exactly what it is that you want and what you don't want. So we need to be specific, we need to be comprehensive, we need to get a scientific view of people. We need to map and understand them. So I cannot help, just by virtue of what my interests are, I cannot help to talk about toxic leaders and the different types of leaders that you get. So I'm sure you're all aware of Adrian Furnham's work in this regard, and etc. Him specifically talking about the sad, bad, and mad leaders, and obviously the bad leaders would typically be, as to Niven's comment earlier as well, your Machiavellian, but then also your narcissists, your psychopaths, all of them being there, being in the work environment, unfortunately, and at the leadership level is often the place where they will be drawn to and where you will find most of them. And they also have the most impact, obviously, in the organization. And they then impact or have cause and create exactly those norms that we are wanting to guide against. With these kinds of leaders, what you will get is an environment where there's a lack of psychological safety. There's a lot of psychological danger. And that actually works absolutely against what you want to get with a healthy culture and a healthy virtual working environment. I have to put the slide on, although I suppose we can debate whether we should talk about it now. But just the thing for me about this virtual or this perfect storm that follows with the toxic triangle of having those types of leaders, then unfortunately having the followers, and then in this context, a virtual work environment actually creating a context and a situation where there is more opportunity for this behavior to play out potentially if we don't guard against it. So I came across this very interesting little article about how gamers and specifically this company called Riot, how they actually, the lessons that they learned in terms of gamification and the rules that they have implemented in games for their gamers actually help them in the organization as well. And what they do is that they actually give people feedback in terms of what they do during a game. Now, in a game scenario, toxic behavior or toxicity is the word that they use for when people give offensive feedback. So it's when people may be cursing as part of the game situation, and actually they talk about that as toxicity. I'm not going to go into this. It's an interesting article. I'll share it in the slides as a reference. I think I have it in there. But they actually found that there's a lot of the games, there will be a lot of toxicity because you will have one or two people that are maybe in a bad space and therefore they curse or they just, are toxic in their interaction with the other gamers. And they use 3 methods to rehabilitate players. They turned off chat logs. That was the one thing. And that decreased toxic language by 32%. Then they also held online tribunals where gamers were able to read chats and then decide on a vote, an appropriate punishment. And lastly, also where they sent these players reform cards with scripts of their own comments. And the people were blown away. They didn't realize that those were the things that they were saying. So from an HR perspective, if I just think, how can we implement that? And that's about giving people feedback, telling them, showing them what is the reputation in the workplace, whether it's a 360 feedback process or whatever, but for people to become aware of the impact that they have on others and how they are perceived by others is maybe the lesson we can learn here from the gamers. I know my time is up, but just maybe 1 or 2 last slides. For leaders, high level, build trust and set ground rules. And I want to just go to the next slide to actually explain this, to say, make a trust commitment. If we trust and support people, we do it with stretch. This comes from Professor Sumantra Ghoshal, which I'm sure you also know about, but the stretch, discipline, trust and support principles. And we make that commitment towards people, you can get a lot more out of them. But then we also need to live that commitment. As a leader, we need to understand what that means. We need to manage ourselves. We need to manage our dark side, and we need to also create those norms and model it, which is very important. Also, we need to provide the direction, and we need to create purpose for people, even in a virtual working environment. How do we connect? What do we do? Why are we here? Why is it important? And help people to connect to that purpose. And then also the peer pressure, if there is peer pressure about what is good, how we should be doing things like the Weinstein effect, that we actually, it's part of the norms that we create, and that we don't allow incivility even to start, never mind the rest of those. And then for employees, I think I can summarize it in, stop expecting oranges from a lemon tree, and look after yourself. That self-care element is very important. And then lastly there, have honest and candid conversations with the person, raise your game, talk with your boss, and take care of yourself. And I think that is me.
Thank you very much, Renata. And to both of you, it was very, very insightful, and I'll have to compliment both of you on your, let's call it virtual presentation skills.
You learn quickly. You learn quickly.
You kept me engaged the whole time. So people can ask questions. I see there are a couple of from Sharon Jansen. Yeah, I think you've dealt with this already, Renata. The comment she makes is that the toxic bullets surely are as live and well in the office as they, and they might even be amplified in the virtual environment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think as both of us said, that it's almost like, because of the complexity and the fact that you cannot actually talk something out with a person face to face. For example, if there's conflict, you don't have an opportunity necessarily. So people are left with a lot of uncertainty. People are left with their own assumptions, and we know what they say about assumptions as well. So definitely, they are alive and well, and actually just even amplified in the virtual work environment. And as far as, and that is one of the things that they say about with virtual teams, the one of the things that they really struggle with is actually the how do we deal with conflict in an effective way. So that is where, as the leader or as a team, then you need to agree on what are the ways in which we are going to deal with conflict. What is our ground rules? Are we late for meetings? Are we not late for meetings? Do we speak up? Who speaks up? Does everyone get an opportunity? How do we deal with conflict? And when someone is in that moment giving those toxic bullets then to others, we need to step up to that plate, and as the leader specifically, if you're part of that conversation, you have to take that up. So for myself personally, I have sometimes tried to take that up in a positive way in the discussion, but also obviously sometimes you need to do it offline, because doing it back to the individual in the session is not going to give you the intended result.
Okay.
So if I can add to that, I think the stress and the loneliness of the situation that many of us are in, and the uncertainty and the concerns, are probably causing a whole bunch of stress and maybe instigating not necessarily toxicity, but unhappiness that could lead to toxicity. But I read something very interesting the other day from Incivility Jonas, and I think it's an interesting metaphor because he speaks of how COVID, if you look at people who've actually died from the disease, by and large, I forget the exact number, it's people with pre-existing conditions. So COVID came along and amplified them and eventually killed them in really sad and regrettable ways all around the world. But the metaphor that he was saying was that it's the same with businesses and teams. The ones that are really struggling, the ones that are going under, the ones that are hitting a wall, are by and large, if you think about it, and I thought about it, and I think he's right, are those ones with pre-existing conditions. And so COVID's come along and just amplified all of this in ways that are enormous and still incalculable. But they didn't necessarily cause it, they just amplified it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not disputing that there's a space to cause some of this stuff in the midst of stress and uncertainty. But in my opinion, I think it's more about amplifying what was already there.
Mm. Niven, is it not also that it is a case of and sorry, it's raining very hard. I hope it's not making a noise. Thanks to noise reduction earphones. Is it not also so that, or would you agree that obviously under stress we become more of what we are? So exactly with an organization that already has some flaws. Yeah. Or teams that already have flaws, that then becomes exacerbated, and that then becomes, just more visible. And if people, for me, the crux of it all is, as an individual, need to have awareness. So an organization or a team also needs to create that awareness, because if we don't have that awareness, we cannot do anything about it. We cannot change it. We cannot even wonder about it because we weren't aware of it. So I think also, just to add to what you're saying, is that to some extent, working virtually is putting the spotlight on it. And it now calls for the brave to, for the sake of survival, it calls on the brave to actually do something about it. Whereas previously, maybe it was okay because everything else was all right and we were sort of fine and happy. We could, put that aside. But now it's wasted. For me, also the toxic behavior that we spoke about being, for example, incivility, etc. It's wasted energy. We often talk about it as wasted energy. We have so much else to cope with at the moment, so much else to contend with and to transverse and to navigate and to whatever else that, if you don't have to do that, it actually gives you a lot more energy to do other things that could be positive and innovative and help your company to survive.
Yeah. Yes, I just want to quickly, but what you are saying is quite concerning in the sense that there's quite a bit of speculation that we're now entering a world where we'll see more organizations becoming a bit more compassionate. Empathy will play a bigger role for leaders, and that we might even move into an era of more conscious capitalism. But what you're saying is that if there's this underlying dark side, then this will be amplified by the COVID. I want to go back to quickly handle a couple of questions here. This one from Tracy Marie, specifically directed to you, Renata. Why do organizations shy away from looking at derailers, dark sides of potential new hires? And she says, then she makes a point, she says, I'm a fan of assessments like Hogan, but I see more and more organizations moving away from these tools. I'm not sure whether that's a trend or not, but...
Thanks, Tracy. Actually, I see a trend of more and more people asking for it. It may be in different kinds of industries. So I think I specifically see in the financial services industry, there's quite an uptake on looking at derailers, and specifically, obviously, at the leadership levels. I think it's because people are perhaps scared. or they don't know what they're going to do with it, or they're not sure. And also, I think in terms of saving costs, they may think that that's the one thing to leave out. But I agree. We need to understand what are the potential dark side, or at least what that person is going to bring to the table, for them to be able to manage it, for us to be able to manage them. That's why I made the comment about the scientific, view of what you're getting, and also what you want and what you don't want, because that is definitely something that we need to bring into it. But yeah, I mean, if you come across organizations that are shying away from it and you want help to convince them, then let me know. I'll try my best.
Okay, so we're talking about organizations being toxic and so on, and the negative side of politics. What role does the CEO plays in this? And if the CEO is the cause of toxicity and the toxic political relationships, is there any remedy apart from removing him away? Any one of you?
So I have a couple of thoughts, and just wanted to close off on what you were saying, Wilhelm, about, gosh, this could be quite ominous if we're going through a terrible economic time. And I think that there's an opportunity for both, right? I mean, we all have the opportunity and potential to be islands of sanity wherever we are, and to create environments that are not toxic and that are decent. But in the same breath, and by the same token, I worked as a police reservist, and we got training in domestic abuse. And there's just more than ample evidence to show that in economic recessions, instances of abuse go up. So be they domestic abuse or be they workplace abuse. Because people are scared, they are incredibly anxious, and they lash out. And they either lash out at home or they lash out at work, or both. And so I think there is an opportunity here for us all to reinvent ourselves, and for economies and organizations and teams to reinvent themselves because their backs are up against a wall. I think we all have an opportunity and an obligation to stay true to what we want to do and what we want to achieve in the world. And the macro trend around abuse spiking as economies plummet is indisputable. And so we've got to grapple with all of that. I think in terms of your question around CEOs, I mean, I would say it's not just CEOs. I think it's, it's at all levels. And certainly I've been in instances where the CEO is incredibly impressive, but there's a toxic layer just below them. Or there's the middle layer of concrete middle managers, I've heard it called as well. But I think for me, and it's timely that we're having this webinar today, because I was giving a lecture yesterday and the subject of toxicity came up. And, you're never quite sure where a lecture is going to go. And I'm not only there to download the content, I'm there to facilitate a conversation. And this one woman was talking very much, movingly from the heart about being in a toxic environment and how it cost her health and her marriage. And it was devastating to listen to. But I mean, and we had a long conversation about it, her and the rest of her group. But for me, ultimately boils down to all leaders, be you the CEO or any other leader at any other level. We all get the behavior that we either demonstrate or we tolerate. And so if you're not demonstrating toxicity, well, hallelujah, but are you tolerating it? And, the one thing I would add to what you're saying, Renata, is awareness around the toxicity is key. I think absolutely awareness is necessary as a first step, but I'm not sure that it's sufficient, because certainly I can speak from my experiences where people are well aware of the problems, but they have a vested interest in things staying exactly as they are.
Absolutely. And
or they have a vested interest in saying, no, I know that that's the overall culture, but it's not me and it's not my team and it's not us. We're trying very hard. Mm-hmm. And so I think awareness is as awareness does. And there's all kinds of defense mechanisms that we all use to shield ourselves from awareness of things that we don't actually want to face.
Mm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, what you said there in terms of what we demonstrate to tolerate was a nice way of, was a perfect way of encapsulating that. Because even though the CEO, for example, themselves may not be a person that themselves display toxic behavior, the fact that you are tolerating it from others mean that you are very much part of the process. So back to your question also, Vilalem, in terms of how do you change that? Yeah, it's incredibly difficult, and there unfortunately is not a one-size-fits-all answer, because it depends on the scenario or the situation. So for me, what is important first is you need to understand what is the root cause. You have to understand what the root cause is, and then you have to deal with that root cause, because the root cause may be the CEO, the root cause may be the fact that the CEO is too kind and therefore not dealing with the people who are toxic, which in itself is a big problem. Or it may be that there's not enough transparency in the organization. The other thing that we are at a higher risk of with a virtual work environment is not necessarily a toxic leader, but is an absent leader, so how many things, it's almost like wanneer die kat weg is die muis baas kind of thing, where a lot of things may be going on that the person is blissfully unaware of, thinking that everything is well, but being absent because of the virtual environment. Therefore, you have to tune up whatever you do, what you do in person, in a positive way. I'm not talking about the negative stuff, but the positive way, the connecting, the communicating, the talking, connecting before content, all of those things, you actually have to tune up and put a lot of more effort into that when you're doing work in a virtual environment than when you're in the office, because you don't have the water cooler discussions, you don't have the passageway discussions, and people cannot drop into your office. So you actually have to create those environments on purpose and interact on purpose or with intent. I think I had it in one of the slides as well. So the fact is, if you now pull that back to our discussion from earlier, it takes a lot more effort and energy to be let's call it an ethical and a wise and a whatever kind of leader in a virtual work environment. It takes more effort and energy, and therefore we are also at risk as a leader. You may also be at risk of getting tired and dropping your mask and kicking the dog, but forgetting that you're actually on, your video is on. I'm sure you've also seen interesting video clips about what people do on video calls, but so it's because we are using more energy also, and I think we need to take that. People are just people also. Leaders are also just people. So most of the time, most people are not bad or evil people. I know that I like talking about toxic leaders and all of that, but most of the people out there are not bad people, but they're just human. And I think we need to also, as individuals or as employees, realize that the leaders are also human, and therefore going back to building trust, being honest, being real. When you make a mistake, to own up to that, because that's what builds the healthy culture and the psychologically safe environment as well.
Thanks for that. Heidi, for Renata, no, I think it's for Niven rather. Heidi Forsking make this comment, or to the extent the question, she says, when you're talking about positive influence, and what do you do when you think you're influencing positively, but other people might think and see it as manipulation?
Yeah, so I suppose a couple of thoughts, assuming that I've understood Heidi's question, which is, I have one intention, but people are misinterpreting it, either the person I'm trying to influence or people who are watching it. I suppose a couple of thoughts is, isn't it true that we always judge ourselves by our intentions and other people by their impact? And how easy it is to come up with a whole story about what somebody else is doing, completely blind to, exactly as Renata said, our own filters and biases and interpretations and assumptions. I suppose the thing is as well that we are all subject to what's called the fundamental attribution error, right, which is a key part of behavioral economics, where we all fall into the trap of assuming that if we've done something bad, for example, manipulating somebody or making them feel manipulated, it was just a mistake. I was having a bad day, or they misunderstood, or whatever. If somebody else does manipulation to us or to somebody else, well, it's because they're a bad person. Told you. They just, you can't trust them. And so I think, you know, the idea that people will misinterpret our intentions, the idea, the reality that people will cast their own biases and lenses and filters onto what we're doing is inevitable. Being aware of it is the first step to address it and to understand where the misperceptions come in. And the second step is to understand and keep checking your own intentions. One of the things that I talk about in a lecture sometimes is, you know, how you need to manage upwards. And I always say to people, please bear in mind, I'm saying manage upwards, not manipulate. And everyone thinks this is very funny. But there is always a fine line in our own behavior and how we can show up and be seen to show up. But like I say, I think the best first step is to be aware of the perceptions and to really check yourself. You know, have I crossed a line here, or am I trying with the best of intentions to influence the situation here? And the misperceptions are ones that I need to be aware of and manage where I can, but I'm not going to necessarily stop them.
So it's interesting, Nevin, one of the derailers, potential derailers on the Hogan Derailer survey is a scale called dutiful. And dutiful goes exactly to that point of playing the upward game, managing upwards. And it goes to a personality trait of not wanting to rock the boat, maybe finding it difficult to go against authority. And that, unfortunately, is something that is often seen by others, perceived to someone who's not like that, will perceive that as manipulation. So exactly to Heidi's point. And someone who you know, whereas the person who is dutiful will just see that they literally inside find it difficult to disagree, for example, with the boss. So I agree absolutely with you. The self-awareness, for me, it's also about the identity and the reputation and being aware of that. What is my identity, my view, versus the reputation I have? And if there's a discrepancy or an incongruence between those two things, or if you become aware that there's an incongruence between it, to actually address it, you know, with someone and say, where it's appropriate, you know, to address it and talk about it, because that will also help you to understand how it's perceived by other people. For me, also, you know, you will never make everyone happy also. So I think people also need to realize that they cannot, they will do right by 99 and they will do wrong by 1 or another 99, probably. So yes, absolutely agree with you. Be aware of it, manage it, but also know that another person is also coming into the situation with their own views and biases and their own potential derailers and reputation and whatever else. And I think if we can try and fade out what is the objective reality and work with that, if 10 people potentially, I mean, that could be another way. If 20 people are agreeing that you are manipulating, then maybe that's something that you need to take account of, and you need to maybe pay attention to that and think, well, if that is the reputation that I have, is that the reputation I want to have, and what is causing that reputation? But if it's one person, if it's one voice in the ocean, then maybe it's their issue and they must go on.
Okay. No, thank you. I just want to check quickly. There's a question here. Oh, it's a long question and I'm a slow reader. So don't you suspect that the virtual workplace will amplify the in-group, out-group issues? Meaning those in the in-group will operate in an even more insular way, connecting in subgroups via WhatsApp and Zoom, etc. And then carrying on, those who are in and feel they are winning the political game have no incentive to change things, but rather see benefit in further consolidating the power of the in-group. Seems to just be human nature from what I've seen. Those who have benefit from the current, often negative politics, seek to further them on, that's going. I think it's quite an interesting question that came up there. What do you think? Who wants to take a stab at it?
I can maybe start to just say absolutely. I think that's what you often see is that it's just in a different format, but it's exactly the same behavior. It's just on a different channel or in a different way. So for me, the only and that we see that, and we see that often, and that is just human nature, absolutely. But what is also human nature, if we can get there and we can get enough of it, is if you can get an is to work it the other way. And that's particularly why I spoke there about the peer pressure and the Weinstein effect. You know, if the leader commits to, this is the way, this is the behavior charter of how we deal with each other, or not the leader, the team commits to, this is our behavioral charter, this is how we do things, etc. And the team then hold each other accountable from a peer pressure perspective, but also the leader doesn't allow that. Then it's a way in which to turn that around and give it a positive spin rather than a negative spiral. Someone mentioned something there somewhere about the virtual vortex, which I think is also a very fascinating way of describing it. So, but to have it, let's call it then a positive vortex. Now, and we all know that that is difficult to do. It's not impossible to do, but it is difficult to do. And it means that it cannot be done if not enough people are buying into it and are agreeing to it. Because what you want to get at the end of the day, it's almost like school bullies, that at the end of the day, those school bullies get outed, they become fewer and fewer, and they are actually the ones then that sort of look negative, or are being ridiculed rather than the people who are potentially in the out group. So almost like, and maybe we must take the lesson. I always find it fascinating how 10 or 20 years ago it was the in thing, and the absolutely fantastic thing was to smoke, and to smoke everywhere in public and whatever else. And it was basically in a few years' time that was turned around, where it actually, and now even more so, but where it became almost a socially unacceptable thing to do. So my question would be, how do we make it socially unacceptable? And if we can commit to the team and the core purpose of the team, and where we're going to in this organization, and what the culture is of this organization, and what our purpose is and what we do, if we commit to that and we clearly outline, this is our agreement, this is what we agree with each other, this is how we'll treat each other, and this is how we will deal with when people violate it, then you are on a start to being able to do that. But then you have to follow it through. And if you don't address the elephant on the table, you will, or in the boardroom, or in the team room, or in the Slack meeting, you will never turn it around, and it will definitely get worse, and people will, you know, in group, out group, will get worse, and it will just perpetuate. But research is showing us that there's no benefit in that. Teams don't perform, the creativity goes down, etc. So it's in the leader's interest, it's in organization's interest, and actually it's in the team's interest, to individuals' interest, to turn it around. So creating enough, what is the word? Momentum. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you. Niven, do you want to add to it?
No, I would totally agree with what Renata is saying. I think two things. One is, you know, the amplification and the consolidation of in-groups and out-groups is not necessarily malicious. It can be completely oblivious, because you've got such tight relationships as an in-group that you don't even see it anymore, and you don't understand how deep and how far back those relationships go. And so in a time of stress, even more so in normal times, you're leaning on the people that you know and that you can have spent a long time in an organization with. And so it's interesting always for me, the language that we use. And often when people talk about in-groups and out-groups, if you're in the in-group, what you're doing is just working with each other and supporting each other. If you're in the out-group, watching the in-group, oh, you see, that's the politics that I'm not part of. And so your perspective and where you sit in it obviously determines how you experience that reality and how you see it. And so sometimes it can be malicious. And I was really taken with that phrase you used, Renata, weaponizing virtual tools. Sometimes it is malicious. Sometimes it's just oblivious because we are so tight as an in-group that we don't even see it anymore. And I think the second thing is to not kid yourself that if you're just in all the meetings and you're playing your part, that you're in all the conversations. There are multiple other conversations happening around you on WhatsApp in all kinds of informal, casual ways. Make the effort. We all have finite resources of energy and time and infinite demands on them. Making the effort to reach out to have a conversation beyond the work, beyond cooking, beyond cleaning, can feel like just one effort too much. But those conversations are informing what's really going on. It's not just the meetings that you're actually part of. So make that effort.
You know what is amazing to me, also how virtual tools, we can also use them to our benefit, obviously, we know that, but we use Microsoft Teams, and I don't know if you use Microsoft Teams, but it actually has, or Office 365, actually has this analytics email that you get every week of your use. So this week, Monday, for example, I get this email saying whatever your analytics, your insights, etc. And it says to me there, whatever, you have spent so much time in these meetings, and it tells you all kinds of things about free days and whatever else. But specifically on this one thing, it says you spent this amount of time in meetings with this other person being in that meeting as well. Maybe it's time that you divide and conquer.
Interesting.
And you know, let her handle some of the meetings and you handle some of the meetings, because why do you always need to be both in all the meetings? So it was just interesting. And exactly, I think sometimes we are so sensitive also about which meetings we are in and not in, and where we invited and not invited. And so actually you only have so much time in the day, so much energy. Maybe others could also deal with that. But that's, communication is also key, very key.
Thank you. That's quite an interesting observation. Okay, then I've got a comment here from sort of a comment question from Sayida. Please provide some guidelines on how to navigate from being invisible to being visible.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the first step is the awareness that it matters, that your contributions will not be noticed if you just put your head down and get on with it. You will not be given an A just because you're such a hard worker, that there is actually more to it than that. And just that awareness, I've seen in lectures and in conversations with people, suddenly makes them realize, hold on, there's a whole other bunch of stuff I need to be doing at work that I've not been doing. And then the practice around it. So, I mean, there's a lot of work around how you personally brand yourself. There's a fantastic Tom Peters article, it's now a classic, it's about 20 years old. What is the brand called you? I talk about it in my book, but go have a look at it, Google, what is the brand called you? You are a brand, and I mean, this is now widely accepted wisdom, but 25 years ago, it was quite groundbreaking that as an individual, you have a perception, you have a brand, people see you in a certain way or don't see you in a certain way. And I have been struck in more than a few lectures when people have shared stories of how in promotion discussions, bonus discussions, performance discussions, their manager was the only person who could talk about them. No one else knew about them. No one else knew what they were doing. And it was only when they got that feedback that they suddenly started to think, now hold on a second. Being the dutiful, invisible hard worker behind the desk is not helpful here when perceptions are what people are going on. So, like I said, I think it's awareness, then recognizing what is the brand that you're putting out there at the moment, getting some feedback around that, and then being quite clear, what is the brand I want to put out, and how do I consistently deliver against a brand? Because, of course, we all make the mistake of thinking that a brand is a corporate identity, it's a logo, it's colors. It's not that. A brand is a promise. What is the promise that I am making in my interactions with other people that I deliver against in how I show up and consistently show up so that they know that that's who I am? That's your brand. And so those things matter, and navigating the minefield of men versus women also matters, because in Sheryl Sandberg's book, she writes very eloquently and persuasively with a lot of research that it is important to figure out how to navigate this as women relative to men. because it's almost expected of men that they will self-aggrandize or speak confidently of their own abilities. And it's expected both by men and by women. Whereas with women, both men and women, can find it a little bit much if a woman speaks confidently about her own abilities. And so again, there's a dividing line between being so obnoxious and boastful that your ego comes into the room 2 minutes before you do. But the other end of the extreme of hoping your work speaks for itself is not helpful. And like I say, the way that we as men and women perceive other men and women and how they do that takes a whole bunch of figuring out as well. So that's a very short answer to a very long conversation and discussion.
Yeah, I agree. And I can maybe add to that as well, Niven, that, for me, we also need to be true to who we are. And so your point there about what is the brand that you want to have, we need to also really consider, think, and really unpack that in order to help us decide what how do we navigate this. So, for example, I would often in discussions, let's say, sit with someone who's maybe done, let's say, a bunch of assessments, and would be talking about what drives you, and what in your personality or who you are is helping you to get that need met, what motivates you, and what is not helping you to get that need met. So, for example, let's say if I'm driven by power, I want to be in a leadership position. I want to have the corner office. That's something that makes, is for me is important. But I'm extremely introverted. I'm incredibly shy. I don't like to speak up in meetings. That's not going to help me get that need met. But also, if I'm extremely low on power and I'm maybe high on altruism and I'm high on whatever, hedonism and all of those kinds of things, I want to have fun and I want to sort of work hard, play hard, but I want to help people. That's maybe what drives me, what gets me out of bed in the morning. Then perhaps thinking that I want to be in the leadership position is going to make me happy, or because others believe that's what I should do, is also not the right thing for me. So now I maybe I'm not speaking up in meetings, or I am speaking up in meetings, but it actually has an untrue, or it comes across as
inauthentic.
Yeah, sorry, it's a long week. My English is up. So yeah, it doesn't come across as authentic. So I think we need to be true to who we are, and we also need to accept what that means and what that means for us in terms of where we are going in our careers. If we know where we want to be, we know where we are or what drives us, then we can actually make a decision and see what is the gap filling, how do we fill that gap? How do we get from A to B in a way that will help us to get there? So for me, the awareness, but definitely then also the being authentic together with what Niven said is very impossible. On a practical note, is possible. On a practical note, in virtual stuff, in virtual meetings, use the tools that is provided. Put up your hand. All of the online platforms now have that. You have an opportunity to put up your hand. That's why it's important that teams need to agree. What is the rules? How are we going to engage? Do we just shout out, or do we put up our hands? And it works for both quieter groups and more louder groups. Because if you quieter groups, the person who's more introverted and wants to think about what they want to say can put up their hand so long, and they wait until they get their turn, and they will get their turn. But the people who are just wanting to shout out need to actually respect that there's others that also want to speak. So they also need to put up their hand. So that's another way of becoming more visible. And I think to agree with your manager, perhaps, or even a colleague, someone that will give you feedback, that, I want to see more of you. I want to see you speak up. So I'm going to actually ask you. I'm going to say to you, or ask that person, please, can you also say to me, Saida, please speak up. What is your view? What is your opinion? And it's a skill that a leader or someone who's chairing the meeting actually. The person who chairs the meeting needs to actually train and use that skill with very consciously, that you make sure that if there's 10 people in the meeting, you better make sure that they all have something to add. Otherwise, why are they in the meeting? They could just read the minutes or listen to the recording. You want people in the meeting who have something to offer, so therefore make it possible for them to become visible. Another way in which to be visible, switch on the cameras.
Good. Look, this is a mouthful. You mentioned it's been a long week, Renata. I don't want to I don't want to tie you too much. So I'm going to, I think there are no more questions or comments. I want to close off by asking you this, both of you. More a macro question, in the sense that if you look at the, and suddenly I see the lights are lighting up there in the questions and so on, but I'm still going to pose my question. If you've taken a view now on our organizations as such, do you think that in terms of toxicity and negative politics, as I put it, is on the increase or is it decreasing? That's now, let's call it prior to COVID-19. And what do you expect now post COVID-19? If you want to take an educated guess.
I'll give that one to you first.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's great. That's lovely.
What do you think, Willem?
Yeah.
I'm not the specialist here. No,
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know what crystal ball you think we have access to. So nice one, Wilhelm.
Look,
I think there are so many opportunities for reinvention and kind of Damascene revelations to people, to companies, to economies, to all of us individually, to really take this opportunity to stop and think differently. I remember being told something years ago when I was quite ill, and said we all have two lives. And the second one starts the moment we understand we truly only have one. So we have one life, we have one planet, we have hopefully multiple opportunities to influence people positively, but how are we doing that? So if this is a mirror for individuals and organizations and economies to really stop and think differently, well, hallelujah, and wasn't it all worth it? And it might exactly happen like that for some people in some ways. I think the reality is, though, for other people in other ways, it's going to be batten down the hatches and more of the same that makes me feel safe and secure. And if that's toxicity and that's abuse and kicking the dog metaphorically and the wife literally, how awful. But it's an inescapable shadow side of the reality of people. Some people, some organizations will come out of this better and stronger, and others will be more of the same. And how tragic, but how true.
okay, thanks.
Yeah, I agree with what Niven is saying. I think just if we think just in general, if you look at the research about leadership, about teams, about organizations, about culture over the past years, it's become you really have to be deaf, blind, and dumb to not understand that what you do as a leader is important, that organizational culture is important, that teams are becoming more important, and specifically that leaders are actually starting to be judged in terms of their effectiveness as a leader, in terms of how happy or how performing their teams are. So there's a whole flurry of research that I think every person who is serious about what they do as a leader or as an organization would have awareness of, and are trying to, at least those organizations who are serious about it, and there are a lot of them, are trying to implement some of those practices. And they are very aware of it. So I think before, let's say, COVID, there's been a greater awareness, and particularly to Niven's point earlier, obviously awareness is not everything, but it's a very important starting point. So there's been a lot more awareness, people realizing that the old ways of doing things are not going to yield the results that will take us into the future. Now what has happened with COVID is we've been literally been put in a, well, I've been thinking about it in a few ways. It's almost like you were busy with things in any way. We were gearing up for Industry 4.0 in the future world of work, and everyone was talking about it, and some were doing some of it already, and some were thinking it's still coming. And all of a sudden, overnight, it's almost like you were put in a pressure pot with the heat turned up, and you now just have to do it much more quickly. At the moment, it feels a little bit, well, especially during lockdown now, at least it's a little bit better. But during lockdown, it felt like it was a plane circling. You cannot land, you don't know if you can ever land, and you don't know when your fuel is going to, you know, be done. So you actually have to change the plane in flight now to become something that doesn't need fuel anymore, because you don't know if you can ever land. So lots of innovation. And I think also people have in that moment realized that the practical effect of the research, meaning we need people, we've always needed people, each other. One of the researchers, Hogan talks about agglutinate, people agglutinate. So, you know, we actually need people to get along and get ahead in life. And people are now practically experiencing that about each other, in the sense that they realize that even though I'm working virtually on my own, as a team, as an organizations are a team of teams. So the organization can only be effective if those little teams are also becoming more effective. So people are practically experiencing, I've heard good stories also from clients about the fantastic innovation that are coming out, and it's born out of desperation. People have to survive, and that they're actually realizing also that they do need each other, and that they do need to cope, and that they do need to, you know, and they're seeing each other sides of each other. So exactly to Niven's point, some who we wouldn't have maybe expected to become better may become better, and those who we would have thought they were on their way to becoming great all of a sudden got derailed, organizations or leaders, and now are not that great anymore, and they maybe what happened, the flaws were just you know, brought to light. So long answer to a short, very complex question, Wilhelm, is there's been a lot of research, people are aware of it. I think that in this phase that we've gone through, there's positive anecdotal evidence of people realizing it and seeing how it plays out, and hopefully that will then help us into the post-COVID or 2021 scenario, where we can again write up and get more research on that, or read about what people did and the wonderful things that does happen, so that people can also buy into that and start to implement more of that. So I hope that it will go that way, knowing that there will be some of the dark side as well.
Okay, ask me what I think. Thank you for that, Renata and Niven. So yes, I think you mentioned that, look, we're in a much more visible world today. I mean, and much more aware of the issues around this. A lot more research coming out. I mean, we wouldn't have had this discussion or this type of topic 5 years ago, 10 years ago on a public platform. I mean, it was just not, there was no interest for it at that moment in time. So my take on this is, look, if desperation and survival can bring the better side out of you, or it can bring the dark side as well. So people can, out of desperation, take shortcuts and so on. So, but overall, I think that this has also been a wake-up call for a lot of people, the COVID-19, and I think that the graph will go up in terms of less toxicity, less negative politics. And I'm talking about South Africa now. I think also we're going to see, you see, part of the problem in this country is that if we talk about the SOEs and government organizations and municipalities and those sort of institutions, we've seen actually politically connected people who are part of the party who's been appointed in those positions. So now it's become a political organization in any case. And I think our president is pushing more towards meritocracy, and we're going to see more of that look, for a leader, there's going to be no place to hide. You're out in the open and you are naked in front of everybody, basically, metaphorically. So I think we're going to see better organizations, hopefully. Before we close off, Niven, a last comment from you, maybe in general, and then Renata, and we close off.
Yeah, I suppose the only thing I'd like to add is picking up on Sahida's question and Renata's point. Authenticity does matter, for heaven's sake. To spend your whole career trying to be something and pretend to be something you're not, how exhausting and tragic. But in terms of showing up in these relationships, often in building relationships and perceptions, often people feel, oh hell, if I'm an introvert, I stand no chance. There's an excellent book called Quiet by Susan Cain. And the subtitle is The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And so I think even more so now, the ability to listen and to give useful input when it matters, as opposed to this cacophony of noise that is coming at us all the time, actually I think stands introverts in very good stead. You don't have to be something that you're not, but the stuff matters. So take the time and trouble to be the best version of yourself for your own sake, your own career, your team's sake, and your organization's sake.
Thank you, Niven. But actually, you were supposed to just say to the people and the listeners that they should buy your book.
Oh, yeah, but I mean,
and the other message I have is never mention another book again apart from your own, all right? Renata, over to you.
No, thanks from my side. Thanks so much for the questions. I think it makes, it gives me further food for thought in terms of what we do and how we do it and what people are struggling with. You also, I'm sure, have our details. Thanks also to Vilalem and the team for the opportunity. If you have any other questions, then you're more than welcome to contact us. And but yeah, thank you for participating and asking the questions.
Yes.
And buy Niven's book.
And
I'm sure Vilalem is publishing.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much to both of you. I think everybody will agree that we saw two really masters of their subject in action this afternoon. It was really a privilege to work with you here this afternoon. We appreciate your time, your effort. It's tough times in terms of being overwhelmed, and still you put together two very professional presentations. Thank you very much for that. And to Renata down in Cape Town, I hope you guys don't drown. To my team, thank you very much. And to all the delegates, I hope you have a great weekend that's coming and that you won't experience too much of a cold. So
make it a long weekend.
Yeah. So with that, thank you very much for a great session. I appreciate that.